Having played a Holy Paladin since the summer of 2005, I have to say that it is not like Blizzard to create a patch with big class changes in the middle of an expansion. Their modus operandi since around Wrath of the Lich King or so has been to wait until an expansion comes out to make major changes to things like rotations and core abilities. And while there have been some exceptions, they were few and far between. Until patch 10.1.5, that is. Of course, if there's an expansion where they should break their pattern, it's Dragonflight. Dragonflight's claim to fame is that it's massive changes to class design and putting the building blocks of class and spec design into players' hands with a new talent system. So Blizzard making it a point to be actively iterating on the new system in ways that can make big changes, even mid-expansion, is an excellent way of proving that they are serious about making the game enjoyable. You know, when you think about it, in the last few expansions, Blizzard would have a borrowed power system, probably one that would affect our rotations and rotational abilities in small but sometimes rotation-changing ways, and Blizzard would devote a lot of development time and effort to balancing and tweaking that borrowed power system. Now that there isn't a borrowed power system, and the talent system has more or less replaced the borrowed power systems, they can instead devote that development time and effort to core rotational and class design. And I have to say, I love it! Of course, Holy got quite a few awesome changes, including one that I had some really mixed feelings about when I first found out about it. As the quintessential casual Holy Paladin, there were several beefs I had with Holy's design historically. To me, the heyday of Holy Paladin's design was back in Cataclysm and Mists of Pandaria. In Cataclysm, I had these abilities in my kit. Light of Dawn and Word of Glory as group and single-target Holy Power healing spenders, Holy Radiance as a group heal with no cooldown that generated Holy Power, Holy Shock and direct beaconed heals for generating Holy Power, Crusader Strike and Seal of Insight as incentives to get into melee, Divine Plea to regenerate mana, Rebuke to interrupt enemies, Judgment to provide myself with haste and some mana regeneration, Holy Wrath and Consecration whenever I needed multi-target damage, Inquisition to spend Holy Power on for a damage boost, albeit one that wasn't a direct damage spell, and Exorcism as a ranged filler spell. In Mists of Pandaria, I still had most of these things. Exorcism got replaced with Denounce, Inquisition got replaced with being able to cast Word of Glory on enemies, which did kind of pathetic damage, to be honest. But at the time, what I was most infuriated about was how Consecration and Holy Wrath got taken away from Holy for no reason other than Blizzard being overzealous about pruning abilities. That experience taught me that every spec in the game needs a multi-target damage ability that's either on a very short cooldown or no cooldown at all. Thinking back to then, there were so many ways Blizzard could have solved the problem back then that wouldn't have harmed any other aspect of the game, wouldn't have been hard to do, and would have given players a much better gameplay experience when they played Holy Paladins. Like making Holy Radiance castable on enemies, making Denounce work with Seal of Righteousness, or simply unpruning Consecration. Blizzard totally should have picked just one of those things and frickin' done it! Unfortunately, back in those days, Blizzard almost never did those little class design tweaks that they should have done for convenience and quality of life, and that attitude from them was very frustrating. But still, I had to admit then, and still say today, that my healing kit during Mists had never been better, and it only felt a little bit different from what it was like in Cataclysm. Holy Radiance having no cooldown gave me a nice weave of group healing abilities. It was good to have a filler group healing spell to fall back on if I ran out of other buttons to press. But sadly, Holy Paladins have never really reached the height of Cataclysm's convenience and well-rounded kit since then. At one time or another, all too many of the fun and functional spells that I had then got taken away. Consecration was gone in Mists and Warlords, and while it came back in Legion, Denounce was removed and didn't come back until 10.1.5, and I'll get into what I think of Denounce later on. Holy Power spending for a soloing Holy Paladin went from a meaningful holy damage buff that was neither overpowered nor underwhelming to a single target damage spell that barely did more damage than the Holy Power builders, to non-existent, to a multi-target damage ability that did less damage per target than the builders and wouldn't have been worth a global cooldown if it were on the global cooldown. Holy Radiance disappeared in Legion and never did come back, getting replaced with group healing options that all had cooldowns, or at least that were very, very small. Eventually, things like Aura of Mercy, Resplendence, and Golden Path added group healing options that were small but had no cooldown, and those pretty much crowd out any chance of Holy Radiance making a comeback, at least in the form that it was in during Warlord's Mists and late Cataclysm, where it had no cooldown, did a splash of group healing, generated holy power, and slurped up mana like Kirby at a buffet. And then Legion, of course, took away the Holy Paladin filler Denounce spell, much to my disgust and deep dismay. I was hoping Denounce would come back when they announced there'd be changes in Battle for Azeroth, but no dice. And then I was hoping Denounce would come back in Shadowlands since they were unpruning all kinds of things in Shadowlands. But again, no dice. I was hoping Denounce would make it into the sweeping class changes that were coming in 10.0. No dice. And now it's back, but in a very, very different form from what it was before. Instead of being a filler spell that costs no mana and could be used at range, it's a PvP talent, a replacement for, of all things, Shield of the Righteous. That's right, Denounce is a holy power finisher. This reminded me of how Exorcism made a comeback for Retribution in 10.0 as a damage over time application spell, a completely different form of Exorcism from the Blade of Justice-esque spell it had been since around Wrath of the Lich King. I posted in the forums about my mixed feelings, and I was specific about what I'd hoped Denounce would be, a filler spell, and the other posters noted that most of the problems that I saw were being fixed in various other ways. For that matter, Shield of the Righteous now deals a decent chunk of damage, still not much more than the builders, and, getting even that far takes talent points, but with its multi-target damage, it pretty much makes up for that about as much as it should for a soloing healer. And it's on the global cooldown, as is its Denounce PvP talented replacement. I decided to switch to War Mode and test ranged combat against a training dummy, and I found to my surprise that when I had Holy Prism to generate 3 Holy Power and Divine Toll to generate 5 Holy Power, I very seldom ran out of buttons to press, even standing at range with Crusader Strike entirely out of my rotation. About as many Denounce projectiles came flying out of my character with this setup as there would have been back in Warlords or Mists. And considering that it was a finisher, it was even more satisfying to cast Denounce now than it was back then. Also consider what Denounce was during Mists and Warlords. A button to press when other ranged spells like Judgment or Holy Shock were on cooldown. That's kinda sorta the role it's playing now, too. Now, I would feel better about my damage kit if I had a filler ability with no cooldown, especially if it were ranged and cost no mana, much like Denounce was towards the end of Warlords. Though granted, with this setup, there aren't many gaps for a filler spell to actually fill. But I still feel like having a filler spell is better than not having one, especially for cases where Denounce isn't actually on your spell bar. But still, Denounce coming back in this form is definitely a step in the right direction, and it's definitely a fun soloing kit. Who knows? The iconic and very paladinish Exorcism spell might just make a comeback as a ranged damage filler. I mean, it was my ranged damage filler spell back in Cataclysm, and Blizzard has demonstrated that they're not just willing, but eager to bring back older spells in completely different forms. If there was ever a time when it was likely for them to bring back Exorcism as a ranged filler spell, it would be in Dragonflight. If they do bring it back, or add any kind of ranged timed cast filler spell, then I certainly hope that they use the spellbook casting animation. That's one of my 2 biggest beefs with Denounce in its current form. The spellbook casting animation is just begging to be paired with a projectile spell, and as I've been saying for years, Denounce would be the perfect opportunity to do that pairing. But they didn't do it. Flash of Light's non-directional casting animation is what they used for Denounce. Again. So I hope, oh so much, that Exorcism gets some kind of projectile to it if they bring it back as a ranged filler spell. Heck, I hope they give Denounce itself the cosmetic boost it deserves and swap out its current non-directional casting animation for the book animation. My other major beef with Denounce is that it's a PvP talent, and well, I don't PvP. And I don't like the idea of traipsing around the Dragon Isles in war mode, risking getting killed by another player, just so I can see the pretty sparklies and enjoy the spell that I have sorely missed for over half a decade. Then again, Blizzard's toyed with the idea of adding some way of letting players use PvP talents without going into war mode, and I hope oh so much that they find a way to make that happen. Again, if there's an expansion where they'll do it, it's Dragonflight. And again, that's because they're not wasting oodles of developer time on clunky and self-defeating borrowed power systems, so there's a good chance they'll successfully find and deploy a way to use PvP talents without war mode. And I sure hope they do. I'm pleased to say that the fact that Denounce isn't a filler spell is actually a minor beef, at least at this point, and I'd prefer that something else function as a filler spell. Either that, or I'd prefer that they have something equally effective in Denounce's place as a ranged Holy Power spender. Again, I get that there isn't much to fill at this point, but I still believe that having a ranged damage spell with no cooldown is better than not having one. To be honest, what with Holy Shock having 2 charges, Glimmer being a core class mechanic, I never really used Glimmer before, Beacon of the Lightbringer being back, oh boy howdy did we need that, so glad they actually listened, and oodles of new mechanics surrounding Holy Shock, I strongly suspect that this, patch 10.1.5, is going to be the new class design heyday that I look back on with nostalgia, much like late Cataclysm and Mists have been the class design heyday that I've looked back on with nostalgia for the last decade. It helps that the class talent system is loaded with bells and whistles like Repentance, Rebuke, Golden Path, Divine Toll, Vanguard's Momentum, Dusk and Dawn, and plenty of other nice-to-haves with cool tools. Losing access to Rebuke and Legion was one of the things that made the game feel like it was taking steps backward instead of steps forward. I mean, seriously? They worked their tails off to make Holy Paladins a melee class in Legion and then took away the quintessential melee utility tool? Seriously? But now it feels like just about every step is a step forward, or at the very least, 2 steps forward for every step back. 2 Holy Shocks is more fun and more versatile than the Bestow Faith ability that we lost, and 2 Holy Shocks are more fun and more versatile than the 2 charges on Crusader Strike, which we also lost. A decently powerful Shield of the Righteous on the global cooldown is more fun than a weak Shield of the Righteous off of the global cooldown, and the quality of life improvements are massive as well. Dusk and Dawn used to force us into playstyles of building up and spending holy power that were often clunky, making you build up 5 or even more holy power and then spend it quickly in ways that pull you back down to 0 holy power. And there were some even more unusual playstyles that Dusk and Dawn used to require in Dragonflight to reap its benefits after its first iteration. These days you can reap its benefits simply by spending and building holy power normally. Beacon of the Lightbringer was one of those talents that had to make a comeback but didn't at first, but now, well, it's back, nice and low in the talent tree. And it's not even mutually exclusive with Beacon of Faith this time around. And we've been saying for a long time that Judgment would be so much better if it generated holy power for Holy Paladins, and finally in patch 10.1.5, it does! Which is one of the big reasons why a ranged rotation with the Denounce PvP talent has as few gaps in it as it does. Blizzard is finally doing these little quality of life design things that it should have been doing all along. They made a really great decision by pivoting to these permanent talents instead of burning up so much time, money, and effort with clunky, self-defeating, auto-deleted borrowed power systems. And finally, their effort is going into things that it is just plain fun for players to get. Of course, if I don't actually talk about Holy Paladin healing in this video, then I won't be doing the things that I should be doing. So, ooh boy, Glimmer is now a core aspect of the Holy Paladin playstyle, and I have never played Glimmer before in my life. I've gotten Daybreak. Seriously, why didn't they just call this Divine Plea? I got Divine Toll to apply a lot of Glimmers. I've got the talent to increase the number of Glimmers I can have active. I wonder if I'll be playing to intentionally avoid applying Glimmer to someone who's at high health. We'll see. I also have Resplendence and Inflorescence of the Sunwell, giving me 2 charges for every infusion of light that I get every time Holy Shock crits. And I've got Tears Deliverance and the buff that extends it when I cast heals. And when I actually hopped into looking for a raid to try this out, my feelings were a bit mixed. I felt like I was being pulled in 2 directions. Glimmer and the fact that Holy Shock cools down with 2 charges instead of just 1, those encouraged me to cast as many Holy Shocks as possible, whereas my Resplendent and doubled up Infusion of Light encouraged me to cast as many Holy Lights as possible. Well, now I know how Holy Priests feel. Oh well, almost every spell that I cast has some benefit that feeds into another one. Honestly, it's a little bit overwhelming, but it's overwhelming in a good way. And as a casual in looking for raid who's looking primarily for fun and doesn't even know the names of the healing meter add-ons, I'm okay with this. And not stressing how to maximize my effective healing, just aiming to keep my fellow players in the game and doing a pretty decent job of that. I like the change to Boundless Salvation too. Before 10.1.5, Holy Shock did not prolong Tyr's Deliverance, which meant that if I cast it at a time when there was a lot of movement required, it would be likely to have Tyr's Deliverance fall off. That was frustrating, but now I can keep it going pretty easily. And the fact that Holy Light makes it last even longer now, it just makes it awesome. Overall, I have to say I'm pretty happy with the Holy Paladin changes. I kind of expect Blizzard to nerf things or tighten things up so that it's no longer as awesome as it currently is. This feels like it's too good to last. Maybe that's because Blizzard has been known historically to make a lot of class design decisions that seem to make sense at the time, but which turn out to be bad decisions in the long run. And Blizzard has historically left things broken instead of risking resources fixing it again quickly. Though maybe that's no longer Blizzard's modus operandi. They're certainly doing things differently in Dragonflight. I can hope that the awesomeness will last, that they'll leave well enough alone, or that if they do make changes, then one of the things they'll do is make some more little quality of life improvements, like unpruning Exorcism as a ranged filler spell, or making things a little less overwhelming in terms of being pulled in 2 directions with Infusion of Light and Holy Shock. I mean, maybe Infusion Stack should last longer or something? Or especially making PvP talents useful outside of War Mode. And again, there is something to be said for leaving well enough alone. We shall see what Blizzard does and doesn't do, but at least this time they did right.